Okay, here we go. So first of all, I found out yesterday that most of you are like future computer scientists and engineers. So probably most of you are like a lot smarter than me. So I'm not going to talk about like algorithm and science and stuff like this. I'm going to talk about methodology and different things we did on Game of Thrones to make all the work happen. So what we mostly did Image Engine, we're like a rather small company, but we specialized in animations and creatures. So we did lots of the animations of the dragons. Overall, there were 308 dragon shots in Season 8, and about 95% of all the dragon shots have been done by my company, Image Engine. So like that's 50 shots of all the shots that we did. Like we actually brought the final, meaning we did the final shots that you saw on TV, and the other 50%, we actually exported the shots and everything that belongs to it to another company, like WETA Digital or Scanline was companies that were helping us out on other sequences. And they did then the final work for us, but they took our final dragon animations and our timing for all the fire and everything we did and exported it to them, and they would then do like the final shots for us. So overall, since there's many shots that have multiple dragons in them, it's 380 individual dragon performances that we were responsible for. So there's different things I want to talk about. One, of course, is like the dragon animation, and another thing is the different environments that we did for Game of Thrones Season 8. And then at the end, I want to talk a little bit of the pipeline and data management that we had to do to get all the data to the other companies without any bigger problems and hiccups. So when you work with dragon animation, one big thing is you start very early on. Before they even start shooting extra shots, you have to do something like pre-animation and previs. Then you have the bug. The bug is like an element that the actors sit on that simulates a dragon motion. And then, of course, there's the final animation and the live cards, so like the shot elements of the actors. So usually like the previs, it starts like that. Sometimes it's done by us as a company, sometimes it's done by a specialized other company that is just a very rough layout of the whole shot. So basically everything that is supposed to happen is kind of blocked out. But a lot of things can still be wrong, like the speed of the dragon, the height of the dragon, how much motion they do, is like still like rough out. You can see like it's a very simple motion, but like the general idea comes across, and this is usually what gets sent to us, is like, hey, can you make the shot work? Then the next shot is something that is very unique that I never worked with in 15 years. It's like called pre-animation. And pre-animation is a weird term. It basically means you try to block out the animation as fast as possible so the client can actually shoot the elements. Because one big thing about Game of Thrones is they try to shoot almost all elements in real. Means the rider sitting on the dragon, like often Dany and Jon Snow or the Nightking, they would actually shoot them in real, and they have to match later with our dragon animation. So to know how they're going to shoot these elements, they have to know what the dragon's going to be doing. So we would actually pre-animate the scene and make sure that roughly the motion is already in the right place, that like the up and down movement and everything can be blocked out. And then they would use this data and like transform it like onto like an actual camera rig and the bug rig you're going to see later that simulates this motion that we established here, and they would shoot the element basically the way we have animated it, so we can later make sure that the actor and the dragon marry together and like they have the right motion. So here's like how this dragon element would be shot. You can see the camera was basically programmed based on our motion, and this bug rig is basically simulating the dragon motion. Like they actually did like a lot of work. Like when you can see, like they have these guys with these wind turbines simulating the wind. There's actually a guy on the side. You can see how the light disappears and comes back. So there's literally a guy like that based on our wing animation. When the wing would block the sun, he would like do this and block the sun. So you would get like the same motion of the sun disappearing for a second when the dragon flapped his wings. So all these things were established before they even start shooting, just based on our pre-animation. One thing you also see is the bug is a pretty impressive piece of technology, but it has, of course, limitation, like the amount it can move up and down and left to right, or when like the dragon is diving like down into a canyon, there's limitation to what it can do. So sometimes part of the animation that was actually done by the dragon was simulated by the camera. Like when the dragon would dive, the camera would move up so it looks like it's really doing like a 90 or 180 degree turn. So whatever we were animating was never done 100% accurately in the bug. So in order then to do the next step, we actually had to go back. We had to go back and track the bug motion and then transfer it back to our dragon animation again, just to make everything work, and that would roughly look like this. So we would track the motion of the bug, so now we have the correct relationship between what the simulated dragon was doing on the camera and what the dragon rider was supposed to do in motion. And then we would transfer all the motion back into our camera and our dragon rig and try to simulate what was happening there. So this is our dragon rig, and it's quite complicated. There's a lot of things I can do. And what we basically would do, like the motion from the bug, all the rotation and translation, would be simulated and actually placed right here on the shoulders of the dragon. So our first animation pass of the dragon was literally the motion from the bug one-to-one transferred. So like all the motion from the shoulder up and down would be the exact same that was happening on set. And then the animator could basically start from there, place the bug card of John and Danny on the shoulder of the dragon, and then add all the secondary animation and the wing flaps and all this stuff. But we would know that like whatever the actor was reacting to on the bug, our dragon would do the same, so like it seamlessly blend together. It was a lot of work, but like honestly, with the Game of Thrones client, like they always wanted to shoot as many elements as real. So even like the fire being spit by the dragon are real elements. It's a real flamethrower on like a motion control rig flying through the air. So everything has to be work in sync. Everything has to be like in real scale, in real speed, and in real camera space. So this was our way of handling that, and it was a lot of work, but in the end, like it really paid off because we were able to predict that it would happen before we even shot the element. So the next step is rather simple, like you would just extract the element, in this case it's Jon Snow flying away from camera. You would just extract him and put him on the dragon, what is a pretty straightforward process in compositing. And then you would put him on like a plate that was shot somewhere else, and you would combine all the elements and you have a final dragon shot. What we also did with the client, because the client was very concerned about continuity between scenes and like correct speed, correct height, like I said earlier. So we would always have to check all our data, not just from the actual camera, because it also has to work from different angles. The client would like to know is like how far the dragons are away from each other, how high are they above the ground, how fast are they flying, and is the dragon doing any weird motions? And what I said earlier about like the wings blocking the sun, so we would always render like a quad cam where we test the dragon animation from multiple angles and not just through the camera. This way we could ensure that like the motion work was consistent and we could cut between shots. Like when a wing flap is in one shot up and in the next shot the wing flap would go down, like the actor could basically, or the director could see that the animation was continuously among shots, so there was like a high level of continuity. And that's basically what you end up then with the final dragon animation, where everything is blocked out. Usually when everything is approved by the client, the dragon is behaving correctly, it looks like he's sitting in the environment, the plate card of John sits correctly in, like it follows the motion, and when the dragon goes up and down, his cape goes up and down. You just combine everything together, and then there's usually a final step that you do, where you do like a little bit of muzzle and fat simulation, or you do like this slight flutter in the membrane of the wings. These are things you would add at the very end, when everything else is approved by the client and working. It will be the final step, and then you would just render it, apply the shaders, and you have a final shot. And there was one special thing that happened on this show. I don't know if you guys remember in episode 3 there was a big fight between the dragons. In the books it was called the Dance of Dragons. The client came to us and had to say, hey, can you guys animate the whole fight from the beginning to an end in one long animation? And then I want to place my cameras around it, and then I want to turn it into shots. And that was a huge task, because usually things like this are not done like this, but we actually managed to do that. It was actually our animation supervisor, Jason Snyman, who started like in the beginning of the show, like animating the shot. It was 1.5 minutes of dragon animation, 2 to 3 dragons, non-stop. Like one single animator was doing this for like a month or two. And here you can actually see what he was doing in the beginning of the show, and then next to some final shots at the very end of the episode, like when it was all put together, and you can see how many animations are still basically the same. So that was a huge accomplishment for us, and the client was actually very happy that we could pull that off. It was a huge task for us, but we were really proud that it all came together and worked out, and I think the final sequence hopefully speaks for itself. So one other thing I want to talk about that we were also doing, aside from all the dragon work, is I can talk a lot about the dragons, but there's lots of information on the internet. So a lot of stuff that we did is also actually the environment. It's often like invisible work, like you would put environment, ice canyon, storms, like behind the dragons. And here's the important thing, that is basically like it should be in visual effects, it should be in invisible effects. You should never see the environment in the background as an actual effects element. The dragon is difficult to hide. You see a dragon, you know the dragon is not real, you know it's an FX element. But the environment always has to look photoreal and believable, because otherwise you get kind of like drawn out of it. The whole illusion falls apart. So in the first episode, we had the winter forest that we had to do, like it's called the Joyride Sequence, when Danny and John, for the first time, like explore the north where John comes from, and he shows her all his environment, like his hometown. And there's a snow canyon sequence, and then in episode 3, there's the big ice storm that is part of the big battle that is happening around Winterfell. So the Joyride sequence is also story-wise very important. For me, it's always important, now that I'm visual effects supervisor, that visual effects is not just about like giant robots smashing each other. It's often visual effects is a part of the storytelling of a movie. The director wants to communicate something specific. Like in this case, the Joyride sequence is, like I said, it's them both together riding. Jon is the first time riding a dragon, so he's sliding left and right, he's uncomfortable, he's almost crashing into trees. But then he's also showing her like his home country and the explore. Everything was supposed to be look a little bit romantic, open, sunny, and friendly. But you still have to tell the sequence. There's a small sequence where it looks a bit more dangerous. And all these things have to work seamlessly with plates they shot in Iceland. So whenever you go back and forth, there always can be one shot that is real, and another shot that is full CG, and another shot that is a combination of both. So we had to kind of combine all these things together. We had to analyze how the real landscape looked and then kind of recreate it as good as possible so the viewer wouldn't see what is CG and what is real. And actually, it's a quite beautiful sequence to work on. So I just want to go through like the single steps that usually we go through as a visual effects company when we tackle something like this. Usually you start like with a key art, like then you do like a rough layout of the whole environment. Then you do more and more refinements, you add all the trees, and there's some final steps to it. So for example, the key art is something that the client provides. So before anything starts, the client goes through this whole movie, like to every episode, every key sequence, and provides a piece of art like this. That's not always done, but it's very typical for Game of Thrones, where the client wants to be in control of everything. So you can roughly see like it's a mountain, countryside, like there's trees, there's a canyon that is kind of hidden at the end, there's like an open sunny sky, and we're supposed to follow Jon following Dany, and then she does something surprisingly. She kind of dives down and like kind of disappears out of nowhere, so you're kind of not supposed to see early on that there's a canyon, like a little edge. So it's part of the storytelling that you're kind of surprised that she suddenly disappears and Jon is irritated and is trying to find her. So these are all the elements we had to watch out for. So this was our very first rough layout. You can see like it kind of matches the key art to some extent, but there's many aspects that don't work that good. So like you can see the canyon is way too visible. You can instantly see that there's a drop down, so her suddenly diving down wouldn't come as a surprise. Then also like the landscape, as it was in the key art, it looks way too blocked. You don't see the sky. You don't have this feeling of this vast openness and sunshine. It doesn't look as inviting. So you start to tinker with it a bit, like you add some sunshine to the clouds, you lower the horizon line, you make the canyon just a little bit more hidden so it blends better into the environment, and the moment when she suddenly dives down comes a bit more as a surprise. And then of course the next step, you had to add trees. And for trees, for a landscape like this, you can never model every single individual tree. So you're looking at hundreds or thousands of different trees. So what you do, you model like a fixed amount that can be 10, 15, or 20 different tree models, and then you scale them and you scatter them around, more or less like randomly. It's based on an algorithm. The first pass usually roughly looks like this. So it's just randomly placed trees everywhere. It kind of looks like a forest, but it doesn't really look like a real forest and believable. So usually then you start looking at like real nature, what is actually happening, and then you see, oh, there's like a riverbed in the middle. So even when a riverbed in the winter freezes, there's no trees close to the water. There's always a little bit distance to that. Then you also see things that like there's usually trees like growing up the mountain, but at a certain height, in the same way that you have like snow-capped mountains, you also have this effect that at a certain height trees stop growing or they get a lot smaller and become shrubs. So all these things from nature you kind of have to observe and recreate in order to create something realistic. And often it's something like if you don't know about, you can't recreate it. You can look at pictures, but like pictures won't tell you like the full truth. You have to understand where these effects come from. So like you try adding like different variety of densities of trees, different kind of trees. There's like we cleared up this path in the middle that is like this frozen riverbed, but also kind of leads and guides the eye towards the canyon. Then up here we have like the last smaller trees that going up the mountains and then slowly disappear. And we added like, of course, the last thing is you have to add some lighting and shading to the trees. But like step by step, basically you get more and more realistic until you have the feeling like you checked all the boxes and like, hey, like now we got a shot that is working. So the final shot would then in the end look like this. You can see like the frozen riverbed also gives us the opportunity to add some extra light, what kind of guides the eye towards where the shot is developing, like towards the canyon. See, the canyon is not too visible, like so the effect of her suddenly diving down works, and everything suddenly comes together. And this we had to do, like, I think for like another 20, 30 shots where we had like this whole sequence where they're flying over this like winter forest. So it was a quite beautiful sequence actually to work on, honestly. Then the next thing I want to talk about is the canyon. That is basically right the next shot that we just looked at, where like Danny and John dive into this canyon. And here was a bit challenging that the canyon is actually, it's extremely simple. Everything it is black rocks and snow. There's nothing to work with. Usually in visual effects, it kind of helps when you have lots of elements to play with. Like if you do a complex environment where you have vegetation and rocks or buildings or people or like small elements, here was really limited. You had black rock and snow, so like you have to make sure that these two elements look really, really good and are assembled and projected in the right way. So usually what you start with is also looking at the scale. Like the dragons in Game of Thrones, they are really big. When you watch the show, sometimes it's not completely clear because you always see the dragons from so far away, but in the last season, Game of Thrones season 8, a Drogon was actually fully grown, so he had a wingspan of a full Boeing 737. So it's really like, it's a ginormous beast that you have to fit into this tiny canyon. So now you have the problem, like I said, I just told you how big this dragon is. This tiny white dots you're seeing, this is the size of the dragon. And like the green and the yellow geometry this is the canyon we had to build. So it's like a huge area of geometry and like surface you have to cover with details and shading and lighting to make everything come together. The problem is if you have to cover so much area in visual effects, there's no way you can build all of that photoreal. So you have to be very carefully like watching your camera. So you do the first animation of the whole canyon and you check exactly what the camera is looking for. Like does it look at the right side? Does it look at the left side? Like how close is it getting to which canyon wall? And these are the areas where you spend additional work, where you add extra geometry, where you add extra details, where you add like a lot of the small stuff that kind of makes it realistic. And then you iterate and iterate until you have enough stuff to work with. So here's like the basic look of the canyon when we did our first layout pass. And of course, you know, there's black rocks, there's snow on the flat surfaces, and whenever there's whenever there's a small cavity or like a little ledge, there can be some snow on top, but of course, it's a lot of details are missing. So the next thing, of course, you have to do is you add all the geometric details. So we start sculpting in ZBrush or other application, and you add all the small geometric details that you find in the real world, like from the broken up stones to little cracks and cavities. And then like you take another look, you start lighting it, and then you still feel like there's still something missing. So you look again, like you look at like real life, you look at photos, you look at references and say, what else is happening? What else? Why does it still not look like the real thing? Then we found out things that are happening is, sometimes what happens in a canyon like this is there can be snow that just gets blown against the surface and kind of sticks on the stone. So suddenly you have a little bit more than just the black and the white. You have these areas where the snow is just sticking to the surface. Or in other areas, it could be that the sun is melting the snow just a little bit. So like it runs down on the surface and it freezes again. So you get like certain areas where the rock is a little bit more glossy and specular. And once you add all these details, then even like with just the two elements, like I said, snow and rock you had to play with, you then can suddenly create enough photorealism to trick the human eye. Like when it comes to photorealism, it's always about overloading the human eye with enough visual details that you basically, for this 20, 30 frames, you have so much to see that you just believe, okay, this is realistic, I buy this. That is the trick of visual effects. The last thing is like, again, is adding the lighting and all the shading. And that is usually when you can cheat a little bit. Like, actually, you wouldn't see the sunlight you see at the very top right corner. You actually wouldn't see that. Based on the geometry of the canyon, the light would never reach it. But this is the good and the bad thing about visual effects. The good thing is you can do everything. The bad thing is you can do everything. So the client, all gonna ask for weird things, or they're probably gonna allow you to do weird things. So here what we did, we just deleted the whole side of the canyon, just to make the transition a little bit easier. You can see how the sunshine in the winter forest that I just talked about, how it like bleeds into, it just makes the transition a bit easier instead of going from like pure lit surface to a pure shadow surface. It just looks a little bit nicer and it makes it easier for the human eye to follow the sequence and to buy this transition and then like have to slide down. We also added a little bit frozen riverbed there with some ice to add a bit extra colors. And then we ended up, we ended up with a final shot. So the next thing I want to talk about is by far the biggest challenge that we had to deal with on Game of Thrones. It's the storm sequence in episode 3. It basically happens during the big battle of Winterfell, when the Night King arrives with his army, is trying basically to overtake Winterfell and kill almost every human that he can find. And the big challenge was about this one, that it's such a long sequence. It was like I think like 60 or 70 shots that alone we had to do on top of the other companies. It was over 200 shots. So like it was a big part of the whole movie, and it was a big part of the storytelling of the movie. There's a lot of things that happened or didn't happen just because of the storm and what it could do. Like they basically got lost in the sequence, because when the battle starts, it looks like, oh, we can easily defeat them. The dragons start wiping out the Wights left and right, because they have like the dragon fire, but can kill the Wights. So they just go down and kill like hundreds and legion of the White Walkers. And the Night King sees it, so he calls in the storm that basically makes it impossible for the dragons to attack. So this is another element where like visual effects becomes part of storytelling. So the problem is like they can't see the enemy anymore, they can't see their friends anymore, they can't just spread fire, they are lost in the storm. They're also starting to lose each other, like they can't find each other anymore, they start yelling and screaming, but like the storm is so confusing, so loud and so irritating that they basically completely lost in it. Then there's also like a song where Jon almost crashes into the trees and basically like, might have killed himself or at least get injured. And another thing is where they almost crash into each other. What was a pretty spectacular scene where they both like slipped from the dragon and almost fell off and like yell at each other like, what the hell are you doing? So another element that's happened is the Night King uses the storm basically to lure them away. So basically he shows himself on purpose and he lures them up above the storm cloud, and then he dives back and he lures Jon away. That's the reason why later on Jon fights alone against the Night King and gets heavily injured, and his dragon goes down in the end and collapses. And only in the last second is like when Dany can come in with Drogon and help him. And the reason why I'm mentioning all these things is like for these story elements to work, you need very, very explicit control about the fog. You need to exactly know when a dragon shows up and when a dragon disappears. Sometimes it's just the tip of the wing has to be shown in a certain frame when a character is looking in a way to say, hey, I see the Night King, and they follow up. So you can't just add a lot of fog and clouds. You need very, very accurate control over the storm, how it looks and what it does. And I want to talk about how we actually did that. This is the final shot, like where Rhaegal collapses, and like basically after the fight against Night King, you see he's injured and bloody. It's like probably one of the biggest shots we did in this sequence. Okay, so let's talk how we did the storm. First of all, you need clouds, and I really mean like lots of clouds. And you need control over the clouds, like I just mentioned, to make all these effects, these specific timing things happen. You need to make sure you can control transparency, density, distance to camera. You need full control over the storm at all times. There's also some special clouds that I'm going to talk about later that are something very specific, and also you need a few things that are not clouds. So we will get to that. So first of all, what we started, we're building like a huge cloud library, and you will kind of see these clouds look a bit weird, and this is like, we didn't build really realistic clouds. Normally clouds, because of the pressure differences, they're kind of flat at the bottom and kind of like fuzzy at the top. We wanted to have clouds that we could use from all angles, because the dragons are flying up and down and back and forth. So we kind of made clouds that for our purpose work from every angle, and from every angle you could look at them. And it's also something you notice that clouds have one specific thing to them, that like the outside edge is usually very fuzzy, almost transparent, because the light penetrates the surface and it scatters. So the outside looks more like cotton, and the more you go towards the center, where the cloud has more density, it becomes more and more solid. So our first idea was, we're just going to use all the clouds and we're going to scale them up and place them everywhere, and then it's going to be rather easy. The problem is, like, this is what happens. What happens when you scale clouds up, but you use the same lighting and the same shader? Like, you have some clouds that are way too fuzzy and they look like cotton candy, and some other clouds, when you scale them up, because of what I just said, they're far away from the camera, the density is not the same, because a cloud shader behaves the same. Like, let's say the light penetrates the cloud for like 1 meter or 10 meters, and then the light gets stuck. If you have the same cloud far away from the camera and you scale it up, it's starting to look like almost like concrete. So what we found out, we had to tweak the cloud shader based on camera distance, based on size, and we needed to automate the process as much as possible, because Image Engine is a relatively small company. We don't have the time to have 200 people optimizing clouds for every shot and every angle. So we started dividing up the storm into like basically foreground, midground, and distance clouds, and we would scatter like a layer of clouds. And then we could optimize the shader and the size better for our shot purpose. We could very easily create a basic layout just by scattering. Same thing we did to the trees earlier. And we would have scattered them a layer. And the reason why we did that is early on we had the problem that like for a reason to tell the camera speed and the dragon speed, you need parallax. Parallax is basically when objects shift against each other at different speeds depending on how close they are to the camera. If we just like scatter the whole distance up to nothing but clouds, you kind of get a very homogeneous image. But if you break it up the layer and you leave some space in between, you can see that every layer looks like a different speed, even though it's the same camera movement. And this kind of helped us. You're like, hey, the shot looks too small, or like looks too fast. Then you could push some clouds closer to camera. If the shot looks too slow, you would pull them further away from camera. So there's things you can do to play with. But this way we had an easy preview. We could tell which elements add to the shot and which one we want to highlight and which one we probably want to play more transparent. When you put them all together, you can see a shot, you can see the camera motion, and you can still feel what the camera is doing and where the dragons are flying. Because the problem is, when you're in the sky, the clouds is the only thing you can anchor the eye on. You don't have any reference. You don't have a ground, you don't have trees. You don't really see where you're going. You have only the clouds to orient yourself. So another element that we then had to add on later is the so-called I think they're called like tentacles or like super clouds. They're like not really like tornadoes. They're more like tentacle fingers kind of pulled out of the clouds. They were introduced, I think, in season 4. I think there's the generals of the Nightking can basically call these like basically with their magic power, and they're incredibly destructive. But for us, like they were not really part of something that we had to interact with, but they helped us to navigate. You could because they would always point towards the battlefield. So in the storm sequence, you could see that Winterfell, the battlefield, is in the direction of where these clouds are, because they are the ones attacking the good people, so to say, the people fighting for Winterfell. And also because they had a direction, they would help you to orient a little bit. You would point towards Winterfell, so you know if they're flying towards Winterfell or away from it. And also, like if you see the same elements in consecutive shots, you can kind of see if they overall getting away from the action or getting forward. The client was like very insistent. They always wanted to know where are the dragons in relationship to the battlefield. Because at every point you can ask the dragons, hey, can you show me Winterfell, like just in this shot? So just give a glimpse so that how lost are the dragons. So we would basically animate the whole sequence, all these 200 shots. You would always know where's the dragons in relationship to Winterfell, and they would actually follow a complete path over the whole sequence and not just randomly flying somewhere with some clouds in the background. And these elements helped a little bit like for us to navigate through the whole thing. Another thing we had to add is, like I said, is everything but clouds. It usually means like generic misty passes that we added like to combine the 2 cloud layers or the 3 cloud layers together and like just connect everything together. Like there's sometimes patches, sometimes the director or the VFX supervisor wanted a very specific area. It's like, hey, up there it looks a little bit too loose, or I can see too deep into the background, but we didn't want to add in clouds, so we had some misty elements we could basically patch. Whenever we needed something, we could just plug it in there and it would work. And of course, there was the snow that we had to add. Because it's a snow, it's an ice storm. It was very important to sell like how cool and confusing and irritating everything is. So we did the same thing. We had like 3 different layers of snow, like also based on camera distance. So one was very slow, basically right in the face of the camera's actors, and would surround them and would be in front and behind them. And then different distances to the background that would look faster and would sell more of the irritation and the action and the speed that they were going through. Because the dragons, I think they can fly up to like 90 miles an hour, but it's quite fast. So to sell the speed, you needed some elements that are very close to camera and that really have this whooshing effect. So you can see how fast these dragons are flying and how much force and power does the ice storm have and how much control does it have over them. So the last element, because we're still not done, the last element we would do is interactive clouds. So whenever a dragon is very close to one of these clouds, you kind of want it to be interacting with it. It kind of ties everything together, because otherwise you just have the separation of the dragon and the environment. And even if both look really impressive, they don't really look like they belong in the same scene and in the same space. So whenever a dragon is getting close to a foreground cloud, you would see him interacting. He would pull some of the cloud away, or he would drag something out of it. We had also some turbulence at the tip of the wings that would like basically spiral around at the tip of the wings, kind of what airplanes do. So this was the last element to tie everything together. And then you would add up with a final shot where basically you can probably see all the different elements I just talked about, how they come together in the final shot. And I know the sequence was very dark and confusing, but that was done on purpose. Like the director really wanted to sell the story that they are lost in the storm and they're not just flying around like a pretty background. So this is where everything comes together, and then we have our final storm. So, and the last part I want to talk about is a little bit of the pipeline and technology we use at Image Engine. Image Engine is a rather small company, but we're very driven on technology and pipeline. Our pipeline is based on an open source software called Gaffer that by itself is based on a framework called Cortex. It's actually stuff you can download online. It's free for everyone. And our pipeline has a little bit different approach than most other big companies. It's completely procedural and node-based. So for like in between people like CG Supers, we can almost do like visual programming. We basically have nodes for like every single action in our pipeline that we can combine. So when I want to do something new that is goes beyond just building a scene, I can pick all the different building blocks and build a new tool. And if there's one element missing, I don't need to go to R&D and ask, hey, I need a new tool that does this for me. I probably just need to ask for like one specific node, one feature that I'm missing, and we can add this feature in as an extra node, and then I can use that to do the next step. So because we had all this data that we had to deal with, this was a very important object. Like I said, we had to export the caches to another company. And at first you think, oh yeah, you just export the dragon animation and you're done. But on Game of Thrones, it is a bit different. Like, since we had to do basically the first comp of these dragons, it had to include the camera data, the camera lens distortion, the accurate representation of the environment, the actual dragon cache, then like I said, the fire elements and like the bug cards from like John and Danny sitting on dragons. All of these things had to be scaled correctly, exported correctly, sit correctly in 3D space as 3D geometry, and we had to bundle this all together with packages and QC files and send to another vendor, and we had to do this for almost 200 shots. So like, what you don't want to do is ask the animator, hey, can you find all these elements all over the pipeline and bundle it up and do a test render and then test it from a different angle and then send it out to another vendor. We wanted to automate this process. So we used all the different tools that we already had in our pipeline. One of them was the tracking tools that I talked about earlier, how we're doing this quad view when we test our animation. So down there you can see all the data that we're running. We can always, at all point, we knew how fast is the dragon flying, how high is he above the ground, how high is he above the zero ground, how fast is the camera moving, like what direction is the camera pointing at, and how high is the camera. And also, we had this automatic pre-comp that we did. So you can see like these fire elements that the dragons like spitting. As I said, it's a real fire element that we would place on a real card that would be timed and like matched to the dragon animation. And we also had this cone that would help another company for the first animation of the dragon, what you see up there. Like another company, for example, had to do the actual fire cone simulated, or they had to edit. So we would export the fire cone for them so they could like time the simulation of the explosion. When the fire hits the floor, they could trigger an explosion or like a fire trail on the ground. So all this stuff had to go to the other vendor, not just the dragon animation by itself. We also had what we call a pre-mult. It's basically the front element. It's like shot through a second camera. In this case, it's like I think it's Sansa and Arya. They're standing on a Winterfell tower. They had to be pre-comped together with the battlefield of WETA, what was a huge area and like was like hundreds of gigabytes of data. You can also see the whole army, the environment of Winterfell. So all these things we had to export efficiently to another vendor that is sitting in New Zealand, and we had to do like transfer of data of like I think 200 gigabytes sometimes per shot. So in order to do this efficiently, we got all the data from them, and we rendered these QC files, and we bundled them up correctly. And later on, when we knew the stuff that was working, we could leave some things out. For example, Winterfell is an element that doesn't change, like the castle doesn't move around and change from shot to shot. So once we had like certain corner points established, we could say, hey, we're not going to send you Winterfell in every shot, we're only going to send you the dragon and all the elements, but we had to make sure things are in sync. So this is where I come back to our pipeline. We had all these tools where I could basically say, hey, go to this shot number. What is a tool we already have? Then find me the geometry elements, find me the camera elements, find me the plate elements, find the foreground elements. So I could bundle everything that is period part of the shot, and then I could channel it down to the information I need. And then I would do in the final step is basically it's certain filterings. Like this is like a little thing that I did myself actually. It's like, hey, like I want the renderable geo because one vendor might say, I only want the high-res dragon I need for rendering. I don't need the low-res dragon. But from the low-res dragon, I want the fire cone because I need it for my animation. So we would have all these tags in our shotgun, what is our production pipeline tool, and I could just tag which data I want to send to which vendor. So, and basically, nice thing again, it's all visual programming. So even like a person like me can do it. So we would just filter down all the things. I could say, is this a dragon shots like this? Is it a fire shot? Is it a shot with a pre-mult? And it would filter down everything. We would only send the data that another vendor actually need. And then all I would do is, in the end, is a QC render. This is like what I said earlier. This was automatically generated with the exported pipeline data. So I could, before I even send data, I would generate a daily that is based on the exported data. So not our internal animation daily. I would export everything and do another quality, like a QC check render that would have all these elements and put them back together. So if this render matches our internal data one-to-one, I know that everything I just exported will work just fine on the other end. And when WETA wakes up in like 8 to 12 hours in the morning and they receive our package, I can already prove to them, I know everything's going to be fine, like it's going to work for you guys. So here are some other examples where we did, like you can see like we also exported like dummy clouds so they could see like where in the distance is our fog. This is an example of how the actual bug card that I talked about earlier, how it would sit on the dragon, because the animator would place the card in 3D space and attach it to the dragon. And if it would show up here, I would know it's working. Then on the other hand, you can see just for a split second, there's a Nightking on the other dragon. So this would tell me this one doesn't have a card. This was one of the shots where the Nightking was actually like a little like a virtual character. So I could quickly tell, okay, everything is working, it has the right camera, and I could export the data right away to the other vendor. This is like some of the examples of data we had to send to WETA. So like it was the fighting sequence outside King's Landing, it was the courtyard on Winterfell. So all these things we had to match without them ever actually working in our scenes or the other way around. We just knew everything would come together. And there's quite complex scenes with lots of elements, and it worked really well for us in the end. This is another example. I don't know if you remember, I hope some of you have seen this show. These are all like the Wights elements that are also done at our companies. This is also another element where we had to make sure that everything works, because the data of like this crowd element to export was, I think, 200, 300 gigabytes per shot. So this is definitely something you only want to do once or twice during production, especially when you do it for like 20 shots. You kind of want to make sure stuff works before you send it. So these are also QC renders where we know, okay, yeah, it's going to work, everything is going to be fine. These are caches that we did for another company for us, actually one that I former worked for at Scanline. They did most of the destruction in the 5th episode, like called The Bells, where like King's Landing was destroyed, and here also we got their base geometry and their city, and we would do our own QC render with their geometry and do our own temp comps, and we could see everything was working and like as predicted before we even give them the scene, and the client could give thumbs up or thumbs down and say like, yeah, this is fine, send it to the other vendor. So that is also already the end of my presentation. So we have no Q&A question. One thing I always want to answer, because that is usually always the first answer that comes up anyhow. What software do you use? Like we use Gaffer, like I said, is our most dominant pipeline software, and it's like other companies use Katana or so. It is not just for lighting. Gaffer basically affects every part of our pipeline, from early on to like final delivery. Gaffer is a tool that combines everything from asset management to scene building. Then Maya is mostly our front-end tool for like rigging, animation, and modeling, together with ZBrush. Houdini is our main tool for FX, so everything that is like explosion, clouds, and super clouds, and snow, and all that stuff. Mari is used for texturing. Arnold is our renderer. We use the standalone version of Arnold. Nuke is for compositing. And Shotgun is our main tool for production tracking, so where we track all the tasks and different things people have to do to make sure that everybody does everything at the right time and to the right expectations. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Hans?
Hello.
Hey.
That was a great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
A lot of this presentation was, well, at least surprising to me, about clouds. And I wanted to just ask a general question. How much of research do you put into things that you don't know as an animator? How much of it is it outside help or just general knowledge? And how much do you go into it? Because you talked about clouds.
Yeah.
You seemed very knowledgeable about it, and that was at least surprising to me.
Thank you. So like when it comes to stuff like this, it's usually a combination of like, it's not the first time I have done clouds. Like I'm doing this for like 15 years. Like clouds, fog, and these volumetric elements are something that pops up on every show now and then. So it's usually a combination, as an artist, especially as a Houdini artist or so, you often have like a more technical approach. You look at like examples you have done in the past, and you look at tutorials and stuff. And as a visual effects supervisor, you look at more artistic standards. So just over the years, you just learn. Like it comes down how serious you take your job. Like for me, I just do lots of research. I go to Wikipedia, I go online and just read about what is the consistency of clouds, like how are they set together, where does different effects come from, like. And also, like, I was an artist myself. I was a generalist, like specialized in lighting and look dev, but I also did some visual effects. So I just, over the years, I learned a lot about like how to create certain effects. And if I ever could not recreate something, I would try just to read about it. You just learn about it, like you just do research. And the more you learn about the topic, the better you understand where something comes from, the easier to recreate. You can always, what I said earlier, you can look at a photo and try to just like eyeball it and match it. But it really helps to actually read about it, like where does a specific effect comes from, like why do clouds look like cloud? And you can find out that like light actually penetrates the volume of like little water particles, and like the light scatters around and it bounces around, and this is where the translucency effect comes from, or this is why clouds look like they kind of like illuminate from the inside. So you just read about it, you inform yourself. It's not necessary to get a job in this business, but like if you want to make it far, it definitely helps like to get yourself into it and like think about where does something come from, not just like how can I recreate it, like to actually understand it.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
No problem.
Any more questions?
Hello.
Hey.
I liked your presentation, firstly, but I have a question. Did you ever work on set or among the cast, or you said you talked to the director, right?
We don't talk directly to the director. Usually companies like ours, they work like with a visual effects supervisor on the client side that oversees all the different companies. Sometimes if you're big enough, like you have your own visual effects supervisor working on set, but I personally did not work on set. But that's something I'm probably going to do like very soon in the future. John's got promoted to visual effects supervisor. That might something that's going to happen soon, and I'm super excited for that. But right now, I have never been on set, sadly.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone have any more questions for Hans? Or okay, I have a question if I can.
Okay.
So, first of all, great keynote. Thank you so much for coming.
No problem.
Secondly, being a big fan of Game of Thrones, I was very curious about the big fight between the dragons in episode 3 of last season. So, the question is that when you were creating the battle, what was the big challenges? In this case, as you've said to the question of my colleague here, that you work mainly with the visual supervisor of the show instead of with the director or the writer. So how did you accomplish the vision that the writer and director wanted to pass with that battle? Consider, for example, the battle was really, really dark. I remember it clearly from the episode. So how did you accomplish that, combine it with the vision of the director and the writer of the show?
That's actually a very good question. Honestly, what it comes down to is how good the visual effects supervisor is on the client side. That is always like their big task is, the problem in visual effects, there's always like all these filters. Sometimes these executive producers, they have their own opinion, then there's the directors and showrunners, then there's the visual effects supervisor on the client side. So it gets to all these filters, and the better everybody's doing the job, like you kind of have to learn to take yourself out of it a little bit. I have the same problem right now that I run my own show, is you have to understand what does the client want, and you can help and guide him and give feedback, but it's actually not so much about like, oh, I have this great idea and I want to put it to the screen. It's like, no, you're like, you work really good on you have to understand what does this person wants to achieve. Like, and sometimes they have trouble or like problems really describing that. So your job as a visual effects supervisor is to extract what does a person want from me, and then explain this to your artist. Like, it's actually like the secret is probably to remove yourself a little bit and learn to interpret and understand the client. So in our case, where we indirectly connected to another visual effects supervisor, it is that person's responsibility to give us the right idea.
Okay, thank you so much. Does anyone have any more questions for Hans? No? Okay.
Hi,
Hey.
great presentation. I was just curious, when you're passing all of this data to the other studios, are you just passing the geometry data, or are they rendering the same sort of software? Like, or do you have to? Are they recreating all the shaders and materials on their
No,
side?
like we only exported, like aside from all the plates and camera lenses, like we get on like ST format for the camera distortion and other stuff. For all the geometry, we basically just agreed like how many subsamples do you want, because like they want to have slightly different expectations. And geometry-wise, it was just a geometry expert, but we would before test back and forth that we like, because the model, at the end of the show, sometimes the models separate between different vendors. So we had to make sure that we have the same UV set and the same density of the mesh, and that the UVs and textures would work. So you would do like one test run and say like, hey, does this cache work for you? Does it have all the attributes, all the UVs, all the different UV sets? And when they would say like, hey, this works with us, we would basically send both companies, send test vendors to the vendor and say like, okay, it looks identical or looks good enough. And then we would go from there.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, a big round of applause for Hans.
Thank you.